Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Humanities for the Public Good Symposium. My name is Ashley Melzer, and we're excited for today's conversation. And the rest of this week's events, I'm going to pop a schedule on the screen. Please join us for some of it. But today, I'm thrilled to kick off our conversation with some of the team behind Warren County 1921. Before we get started, we feel it's important as stewards of public engagement to acknowledge that the Triangle overlaps with the historic territories of Siouan, Iroquois, and Algonquin indigenous communities. Today, their descendants belong to sovereign nations that continue to resist systematic erasure. Let us honor them whose land we are on and the enslaved people whose labor built the wealth and laid the foundation of this university. We recognize the persistent realities of that history, and we invite you to work beside us to create change. For today's conversation, we are going to have some discussion between our folks, but we're also going to invite you into the conversation with some questions. So please, as you think of those, throw them into the comments on the chat. We'll get to them. We're really thrilled to welcome three guests today. We have Jacqueline Lawton, a playwright, dramaturg, producer, and advocate for access, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the American theater. Glenn Hinson, associate professor of folklore and anthropology, who's directed a variety of public folklore projects, and Jerry-Ann King-Johnson, co-founder of the 1921 Project. She's a textile artist, community activist, and founding member of the Heritage Quilters in Warrenton. And up first, we're going to hear from Jerry-Ann.
And what you will hear from me is Salome Coleman, who was the fiance of Jerome Hunter. And Jerome Hunter was one of the men who was shot and wounded in a gunfight in 1921 in Norlina, North Carolina. And I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback here. So let me try it again. So Salome says, Lord, Lord, I was hoping to marry Jerome in a year or so. Now he done got himself shot fighting them white men. Well, he could have been killed in that gunfight. Those evil white men can't stand to see colored people stand up. Always got to bow down to them, yes or this and yes or that. Those Bullock boys had a right to ask for their money back for them rotten apples. Every right. But not in this here world. Just ain't right for those white men to try and punish the whole colored community because some colored men didn't bow down to them. Now Jerome done got himself shot up and had to go to the hospital. Well, I'm thankful he got to the hospital knowing those evil crackers, they would have rather seen him bleed to death. Now, what am I going to do? They took him to Raleigh to the big prison and no telling how much time he will be there. I guess I should be thankful he was in the hospital and not in that jail when they took Mr. Williams and Plummer out and killed them. They beat those poor men, shot them up, and left them there beside the road. Lord have mercy, what am I going to do? I love that man and want to marry him. I guess I better get myself together, do something with my life. So that's the lament of Salome Coleman. And like I said, she was the fiance of Jerome Hunter, who was one of the men involved in this gunfight in Norlina in 1921. And it started all because two men had gone to purchase apples. And they were given bad apples, and so they demanded their money back, and that was the beginning of a whole list of violence and atrocities and just evilness. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Jerry Ann, for sharing that beautiful work with us. I'm excited to hear from you about what got you interested in doing this project and working with Glenn and the other artists on not just the performance, the play, and this I joined you all with the second iteration of the play, but also the conversation series that happened preceding the play. What for you was a driving force behind your involvement?
Well, I think and I had a lot of help from a lot of people in the community. I think what we saw as a really pivotal moment in Warren County history, um, it was the 100th year anniversary of the lynching of Plummer, Bullock, and Alfred Williams. And we knew that it was a time to look back on that history and think about how that history shapes who we are today, but not just stop there and look beyond what can we begin to do now in our community to ensure that there is equity and justice for all. So one of the members of a group trying to establish a monument working with the Equal Justice Initiative to recognize the murder of Alfred Williams and Plummer Bullock, had suggested that we do a reenactment of the gunfight. And that finally led to, well, let's just do a reenactment of the play. That might be a little safer for us. And so she came across the actual trial script. And we had a local playwright help us to develop it, and using the research that Glenn's students in the Descendants project had gathered, we were able to add some storyline to that actual trial. So it was very, it was the right thing to do and the right time to do it. And it brought a lot of people together to think about this history and why it is important. So that was my motivation, to get people thinking about the impact of 100-year-old incident on our community and get people to talking about it. What does it mean? And we've had so many lynchings here in North Carolina. And so it just raised the question of how do we commemorate, or how do we bring to light these incidences?
Thank you, Jerry Ann. I really appreciate that you shared.
I think that's about it. And so that was 1921 when we did the original reenactment of the trial. We called it Seeking Justice. And then we were fortunate enough to be able to bring in Jacqueline in 1922 to help us go deeper with the script. And we were able to include vignettes of people who were connected to the men who were arrested in that gunfight, and to the two men who were lynched as a result of being arrested. We knew last year when we did the play that it was a very male-oriented story, that we didn't have the voices of the mother of Plummer Bullock, or Salome, who was the fiance of Jerome Hunter, who was shot and actually ended up in the hospital, or the voice of Tempe Williams, who was the widow of Alfred Williams. So we wanted to bring those voices in, and Jacqueline helped us to really flesh out those characters, to build those characters out. And it was so much fun and so exciting. We used, again, the research and Glenn's research from the Descendants project. We had profiles of each of the five people that we chose to focus on. They were Tempe Williams, as I mentioned, Salome Coleman. There was Betsy Burwell Bullock, who was the mother of Plummer Bullock. James Green, who was the jailer at the jailhouse. He was an African-American man. And there was Martha Bullock Sharon. So we spent some time, I think maybe 4 or 5 Sundays, Jacqueline, actually writing, reflecting, and rewriting, and editing. And so we were able to bring those voices in, and it was just it was a powerful addition to the original script. So I think that was my motivation, was to tell that story, tell a fuller story of the incident of the gunfight, and then the arrest of the men, and then their trial.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sherry Ann. Glenn, I'd love to bring you into this conversation and hear from you. I'd love to hear a bit more about the Descendants Project and how you learned about the Norlina 16 and how you got involved with Jerry Ann and the amazing community in Warren County to tell this story. And again, I know that this year was the second performance. So I'm curious to hear about your engagement and what excited you to do this work.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you for that great summary, Jerry Ann. You know, our engagement there as facilitators, as aides, as researchers for the folks in Warren County is all part of a larger project that we're calling the Descendants Project. The Descendants Project was prompted by the Equal Justice Initiative shortly after their publication in 2015 of Lynching in America, their report of the sort of full story of racial terror lynchings. We asked what we could do, and their suggestion was that we begin to locate and speak with descendants of those victims of racial violence. So we set out to do that as our project. One of the counties that we began to work in, where, as Jerry mentioned, in 1921, there were 2 lynchings, was Warren County, a county that has always been a majority African-American county in the center of the state on the Virginia border. So essentially, as we began to work in that county, with the county, with the NAACP, with others there, we quickly realized that not only was there deep interest in the county, but there was a much fuller story to be told. Not only the story of those who were murdered, but as it turns out, the more we learned, it became a story of a gunfight, a pitched gunfight between a white mob advancing on an African-American community in the town of Norlina, and the group of Black men that moved from that community to protect their neighborhood. It was the arrests that out of that gunfight that led to the jailings, the incarceration of 18 men, and literally less than 24 hours later, 2 of those men were taken from the jail and lynched. The other men, however, were confined to hard labor in the state penitentiary until their trial. And then 4 months later, were tried in Warrenton, in the county seat of Warrenton. And what the dramatization, the initial dramatization, tried to do was to capture a portrait of what happened at that trial. And in so doing, to tell the stories of not only those who were lynched, but also the stories of those 16 other men who were being tried. You know, our goal from the beginning was to, in whatever ways we can, engage with the community, to as we find descendants, and as we talk to community members, and as we try to recreate the fullness of lives and not merely the partialness of victimhood.
Mm-hmm.
So often the stories that we get when we think about racial violence are stories that center around those moments of violence in which these folks were acted upon. And we hear so little about their occupations, their families, their church going, all of the dimensions of their life, which lend a fullness that is completely erased in the portrait that focuses on violence. So our goal was to try to, and is, to try to discover lives and work with families and communities to unfold those lives. And in this particular case, in Warren County, through the dramatization, to offer to the public a different picture of who those men were and who their families were, and why that is all important to today.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. Thank you. That's beautiful. I also want to lift up, having been a part of the process as a dramaturg, what I found most beautiful about this work is that you didn't just work with the community, you were led by the community. You were led by the community in terms of the stories that were going to be uplifted, the way the work was going to be presented. And I think that's really important. Glenn, so for some folks who may not have been able to share in the experience with us, I know you have some photographs. Do you mind walking us through what we're seeing in the different images as they appear for us in front of our screen?
Not at all. And Jerry, I would invite you to contribute here as well.
Okay, great.
Essentially, we should probably start right there. The courthouse in which the men whom we've come to call the Norlina 16 were tried in May of 1921. This is the same courthouse that is in use now, and the courtroom in which the dramatization, which was named Seeking Justice, was held, was the same courtroom that those men were tried in this year 101 years ago. Looking from behind the judge's desk, here we see what that courtroom looks like, with, on the right-hand side, images of the 16 men of the Norlina 16, or at least 15 of those men, because it is Jerome Hunter who's sitting at the chair with counsel. Jerry, you should probably acknowledge yourself here.
Yes, that's Wadey Ryan in the pink top, and myself. And we did the narration last year, and we also did the narration this year. And if we can back up, Glenn, to that previous photograph of the courthouse, you'll see that you can see a little bit of the uniforms, the prison stripes. What we had to do because of COVID last year, we couldn't imagine having 14 men sitting that close together with the prison stripes on. So we just had them sort of draped over a silhouette, and it still had the impact of the defendants there in the courtroom. And that is Jerome Hunter and the sheriff escorting him out of the courtroom after the trial, after he has been sentenced. And this is Anita Williams, and she did the part of Tempe Williams. And it was just a powerful delivery because at that time, Black people were not allowed in the courtroom unless they were on trial. And so the way we set it up is we kind of divided the courtroom. We had the court with the judge and the defendants and counsel and Jerome Hunter. And then on the other side were like the people who could not come into the courtroom. So Tempe Williams, who was the widow of Alfred Williams, who had been murdered, taken out of the jail and murdered, she spoke very passionately about what it was like, what it was what it has been like trying to raise children. And she had 5 children. She had a set of twins. And as she looked around the courtroom or the courtyard, because she was outside, she kept wondering which of these men, were responsible for killing her husband. And just sort of reflecting and thinking about, could it have been this man or that man or all of these men in this little circle talking? Could they all have been involved in killing my husband? And this is Salome, performed by Earlene Suit Henderson. And one thing we learned from the profile of Salome is that she was quite a dresser. And she and Jerome were quite the couple. And Earlene did a very powerful delivery of the piece that I wrote on Salome. And there she is, dressed to the nines with her hat and her suit on.
Felix Jones was a rather remarkable player of the black jailer who was at that jail in 1921, John Green, Mr. John Green. When the jail was assaulted by a white mob, 2 men were pulled out of that jail and killed. The person that wrote this monologue was actually Mary Somerville, a woman who herself had been the jailer in that very same jail for 17 years. Mary was the first African-American woman jailer in the state of North Carolina. She worked at that jail for all of those years and never heard the story of what had happened in 1921. And so when we were thinking about vignettes and who would compose those vignettes, it was sort of a natural to ask Miss Somerville if she could reflect on the experience of this other jailer all those years before. So Tammy Evans wrote the role of Martha Bullock Sheeran. One of the things that we had discovered literally the year before, and when I say we, I'm speaking of students researching the life of members of the Bullock family, were able to locate a granddaughter of Plummer Bullock, one of the men who was lynched, of his sister, who was one of the only family member who stayed in North Carolina after those murders. And conversations with her led us to a whole set of understandings about how when she came down, the woman with whom we interviewed, when she would visit as a child in Warren County, visit her grandmother, the sister of Plummer Bullock, she never understood why. First, she never heard the story of the violence or the lynching. And 2, she always noticed that when her grandmother walked downtown, she asked her children to be very deferential. There were no gazes in the eyes of white folks. There was no talking back to white folks. This would have been in the 1950s and early 60s. And those grandchildren never completely understood. They were spending the summers here, but they had grown up in Baltimore in a very different world. And it was interviews with family members that led us to be able to provide the material to the vignette writers. And in this case, Tammy Evans, who you saw, wrote the narrative of the experiential narrative of what it would have been like to be the sister of this man who had been killed standing outside the courtroom on that day.
And there's Thomas Park. Glenn, do you want to talk about Thomas, or?
I think you could say a word about Thomas, Jared.
Well, before I say a word about Thomas and his wonderful play, he did the original version for the 1921 presentation. One thing about Tammy Evans, I have to go back to Tammy a little bit, because we think that she may have also been related to Martha Sharon Bullock. We don't know that, but she is of the Bullock family. And so when we talk about working with people in the community, there is that another layer of intensity and appreciation, because you're delving into your own history, into your own community. And so now about Thomas, and I think that in Thomas writing the original script, that was what he drew on, his experience of living in Warrenton and in Warren County, and knowing some of the subtleness around the relationships between white people and Black people, knowing the language, and was really, really very thoughtful, as that photograph kind of conveys, in how he did that original script of the trial.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for giving us, particularly those who weren't able to have the experience of seeing it live and in person, a sense of what it was like. And for me, as the dramaturg on this project, so dramaturg is someone who may do research around the world of a play, or someone who helps playwrights tell the story. My job was more working with the beautiful writers to to turn the history into a personal narrative. So like Jerry Ann said, we met for 5 or 6 Sunday afternoons, and we talked about what it might be like to have lived during this time period, and what it's like right now to live in a time period where racial violence still happens every single day. And how do we as a community not only come together to honor those who we've lost, how do we come together to move forward as a community, healing and thriving? And so it's been a really humbling experience to work with the 5 writers, to learn more about what Glenn does in his class. And so I'm really excited for this opportunity to share more about the work we did. And it was really wonderful working with Thomas on his beautiful play, because it's not every day where a playwright says, sure, I'll dig back in and do a revision, and then bring in more voices outside of my own. And so it was really beautiful to work with Thomas. And we did it through some harrowing circumstances. There was a day that we met where the shooting happened in New York, and we came together. We're honoring an act of violence to a community as an act of violence is happening. And I remember that day saying, there's no other place I'd rather be than with this community of people who understands what that means to come together healing. I know we're going to turn it over to our audience, our YouTube audience who's watching us, but I'd love to hear from either one of you. What has the community response been to the performance, or even to the conversations that happened leading to the performance?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think that it was a really, first of all, it was just, wow, why didn't we not know this story? And then there was a hush hush, like, yeah, I heard something about this story. I think that Miss Williams, Sandra Williams, she reflected on how she was a descendant of Alfred Williams, And she reflected on her mother, who casually said one day as they were driving home, "Oh, that was where Alfred Williams was lynched," pointing to a place on the Norlina Warrenton Road. Not knowing, and it was Sandra Williams, I'm sorry, and Sandra had no idea that this had happened, and she wondered why at that particular point, her mother was up in her 90s, did she finally say this, that's where there was a lynching. So I think that people reacted in a range of ways. I think there were white people who said, "Why are you bringing this up now? History is history. History is the past, and now we live in the present." And I think we tried at every chance to say that history is never just the past; it is always with us. And I think that for Black people in the community, there was this question of where did the fear come from, or what prevented us from hearing the story. And one thing that happened in the last panel, Jacqueline, you had asked about the panel series. I didn't get a chance to talk about that. But in that last panel series where the Descendants talked about why they hadn't heard the story, or when they heard the story, or they knew about the story, it seemed that people who family members who left the community after the lynching, the descendants of those family members were much more able to talk about the murders. And while descendants of people who stayed in the community, they were very fearful that I don't need to talk about this because there may be some repercussions. The situation that Glenn described with Martha Bullock and her grandchildren, like, let's just not talk about this. So I think the impact has been, we need to talk about these stories. We need to understand how this history and these stories reflect who we are today, how they impact our identities as Black people, as white people, as community people. So I think that has been one impact. And I think we're learning that a lot of the resistance to telling these stories comes from a place of not shame, but wanting to maintain some kind of fairy tale image or view of the community, that, it's just, everything is fine. Everything has been fine, and everything is fine now. And if you all stop talking like this and telling these stories, it'll be fine in the future. And I think that is an important piece of that.
Glenn, did you have any reflections, or any people from the community reaching out to you, and either about this conversation series that happened or the production?
I think that, I think it's, first of all, it's important for me to re-acknowledge that as a white presence in this space, that my role is more to listen, to be guided, rather than to take that leadership position in any ways. In a county like Warren County, where whiteness has been sort of a hammering fist for hundreds of years, and where the power of that fist is still prominently felt, I was struck, and have been struck, and was in fact back in the county just this last Saturday, was struck by how silent the white community is and how unwilling they are, except for a very few people, to even begin to address these issues. The willingness not only to abide by the erasure, but the willingness to continue to erase, to continue to deny that importance, as Jerry said, of history, is so profound and pervasive in that community. So that I think there's a telling story to be had in the fact that in the discussion series that was looking at the racial history of the county, 5 weeks, 5 successive weekends in the public library, all supported by the Humanities for the Public Good, I should say, that not only was the participation predominantly African American, but in the first one of those, the mayor showed up, the mayor of the town of Warrenton. The mayor showed up long enough to offer his welcome and then to leave before the panel started. So not even staying to listen. And that's been my experience of that part of the community, which is sort of more willing to speak with me as a white person, where there is that, just not wanting to talk about this and wondering why we're stirring it up. That's the word, that the phrase that's been used again and again there.
I see that happening a lot. In addition to being a playwright, a dramaturg, theater artist, and educator, I'm also a racial equity facilitator. And I see that happening a lot, this idea of, why are you stirring this up? Why are you going back? Can't we move forward? Can't we show up together as a community? And I also see how in these interactions, it's often easier for white folks to engage in conversation, which is why it becomes really important for white people to be a part of an equity and justice movement. Because if you're showing up, if you care so deeply and passionately, it can open eyes. We have a question. I have the same question. Are there plans for any future performances, future conversations? What are the thoughts right now on what might be next?
Well, I think if we, that question came up after the reenactment, the second reenactment. And I think that one thing that if we did it again, we would try very hard to include the voices of descendants of the white mob. We do know that the grandchildren and maybe even a few children of the people who were in that mob, that white mob, are still around. And if we could hear their stories, because that's really what so much of this work is about, people telling their stories, not the stories filtered through the rhetoric that they hear on, Fox News or any place like that, but their personal stories. And I think that would be an added piece if we did the reenactment again. I would love to do it. I don't know if we'll ever be able to do it in the courthouse again because of so many restrictions, but I really, I think doing it in that courtroom has a lot of power in it. So, and I think the next, in terms of the conversations, we're hoping that in 2023, we will have an opportunity to do some community-wide conversations around healing, race and healing. We have asked for some support and working with Everyday Democracy, a nonprofit that's based in Hartford, Connecticut. It's a national nonprofit. And hopefully we will be the site for them helping us to do some of those conversations. And we're looking to involve at least 200 Warren County citizens. So.
Wow. Oh, that would be amazing. That'd be really, really wonderful. And it is powerful to have this conversation in the court, because I think about when you read through the trials, the people who were on trial never had a chance to speak. They never, their voices were not heard. Their side of the story, their experience was never captured. And then, as been shared before, so many of their family members and Black folks weren't even allowed in the space. So I love occupying spaces in that way, in these politically charged ways. So it's really beautiful that it did take place in the courthouse. It'd be great to have that conversation again, because we know so many things haven't changed. So to have this constant reminder that we're not letting up, justice is something we're always going to demand, be part of the work, I think is really important. Okay, so I'm just going to look to see if we have any more questions from our wonderful audience.
You know, I would add that add to Jerry's comments about the next year. 2 comments. One is that one of the players this year, Felix Green, who played Felix Jones. Is it Felix Jones?
Felix Green.
Felix, who played the role of the jailer, that after he did his performance, which he found absolutely wrenching, he came up and said, "If you do this again next year, don't ask me." And he said, "Because I can't do it again. I wouldn't be able to do that again." We did film the entire performance this year. So there is hope that the film itself, you know, when we put together that as some form of documentary, we don't know exactly what form it would take, but that it will be useful possibly in other communities as well. Because this, I think one of the things about doing this in Warren County is possibly offering a model that is a completely community imagined and community enacted model for other communities to begin to engage in similar projects.
Yeah.
So that this doesn't just end in Warren County.
Right.
I know that there were also folks from other counties there that have already voiced the fact that they were inspired.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good.
Folks from other NAACPs in particular who said, "I want to figure out how we can do something like this."
That's beautiful.
And
go ahead, Jerry.
And Jackie, one thing about the public panel discussions, the series, I think we modeled a participatory way of engaging community, where the voices of the audience, they came into play early on in the in the discussion, right? So, for example, we had when we did the histories and futures of education, we had little vignettes about different educational historical acts around Black schools in the county, like the fact that the Ridgeway school was burned down twice, that we had like 40 plus schools in Warren County at one time. We had one of the largest number of Rosenwald schools. And so we had audience members reading those little short vignettes. And one of them, a young woman, read the testimony of 2 people who were involved in school desegregation. And so it was an opportunity for her to really, to think about what courage these 2 young Black kids had to get on these school buses where, white students were, wanting to fight them or not let them on the bus. What it was like being in a school and being called names and so forth. So we did that. We had that little section at the beginning of each of the public panel discussions where the audience members could really get involved on the progressive Black thought, we had people write down who they thought of as progressive Black thought leaders in the community. And, someone just read the list out. And it was just really powerful because you could hear more than just the history from the panelists' perspectives and the history that we had gathered, but what was on the minds of the audience members as well. So.
That's really wonderful. Thank you, Jerry Ann, and thank you, Glenn, so much. I feel that your final thoughts gave us two things: a call to action for other community, one, to share this work again in a way that allows people who both participated and want to experience to do so with no harm. So this idea of how do we put together the photographs, the testimonials, the footage into a documentary that can be shared. That's one call to action. The second one is to make sure that we get to as many people as possible to tell the stories of their communities, because we know these stories were replicated, and we know that these histories are histories that were meant to be erased. So how do we give voices to the people who are here? And then I think, Jerry Ann, what you're lifting us up with is how do we continue to engage the community in the conversations of right now, of this moment, so that we can make sure that those in positions of policy making who determining our ways of life are hearing from the individual constituents always, all the time. We're front and center. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this work. Thank you for this panel conversation. It's been really wonderful to engage in the work with all of you today.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This is Ashley beaming in.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline.
My camera's broken, but I wanted to thank Glenn, Jacqueline, and Jerry Ann again for being a part and kicking off. It was really important to me that this be the first conversation we have, because I think the work that you all are doing are so powerful. Is there a place where people can go to find out more, or to connect with you, or just learn more about the project?
We're creating more. We're creating
more
to learn more about the project that aren't up there yet.
Okay.
There have been a number of articles actually published, small pieces published by the university. So if you looked up either the term seeking justice or the term Descendants Project, there are pieces that sort of cover what is happening and give you links and access to other materials.
Great. Well, I'll tell you what, I will throw that on. It's not going to be there right now, but it will be in the next hour. If you go to our link tree, you can read the UNC College feature article on seeking justice. We'll put it on our link tree so everyone can access it. Thank you again to everyone for joining us for today's kickoff session of Good and Ready, the Humanities for the Public Good Symposium 2022. Please come back, join us we have a virtual conversation tomorrow and Wednesday. We have some live events, some interactive opportunities to meet other people in community and think about the way art and humanities can work together. And we can be ready to get out there and do good work. Thank you again so much. And we'll see you out there.
All right. Take care.